Good afternoon. I'm the Reverend Charisma Jean Marie, and I serve as the Director for Racial Justice Ministries at Scarritt Bennett Center in Nashville, Tennessee. And I want to say welcome to another live stream conversation here on our Facebook Live. This afternoon, I'm excited to invite and welcome co-conspirators to lead the conversation about white women in voting, calling white women out to call them back in at the polls. I don't know if you've registered to vote. I hope you did. And if you've registered, I'm not sure if you've already voted, early voting. And if you haven't, in many of the states, the polls are still open, giving you the opportunity to go and early vote. Listen, it is our duty and responsibility as citizens, as responsible citizens in our country, to go vote. So let me encourage you to go vote, but not just go vote, that you might educate yourself about what's on the ballot. And when you go cast your vote, that you are reflecting on the impact it has on vulnerable communities. Your vote, every individual vote has an impact on vulnerable communities. And so I hope you go vote. I hope you vote this election season. It's a very important election, but not just this election, every election is important. Again, I want to say thank you for joining us. You are always welcome in this sacred space, and we welcome you to join in the conversation. So please, join in by commenting with your questions and comments right there in our post. And later on this afternoon, we will do Q&A where we'll answer your questions. So I want to invite you to ask your questions there on our post. You're always welcome to join in the conversation, and you can agree to disagree with us. You can agree to disagree with the conversation today. Perhaps the people on the panel will disagree with each other. Difference of opinion is welcomed. But what difference is not is hate and disrespect. And so if we see any comments that reflect hate and disrespect, we will immediately delete them, because difference of opinion does not mean you have permission to be disrespectful or hateful here in this sacred space. So again, I welcome you to this space. I'm so grateful for our friend, Lindsey Godwin, who will moderate this conversation. Lindsey, thank you for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sharizna. It is a pleasure to be with y'all today, and we are grateful for this opportunity. Thank you to you, Reverend, and for the Scarritt Bennett Center for hosting this conversation, this necessary, vital, complicated conversation that we're about to have. My name is Lindsey Godwin. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Assistant Director for the Carpenter Program in Religion, Gender, and Sexuality. And I come to this work because I know that we can't do that work without paying attention to the ways that whiteness and race and all the other intersecting oppressions show up in our bodies, in our faith, in our everyday lived experiences, and in our relationships. I spend most of my time facilitating hard conversations, so I'm super excited to be in this conversation today. I'll have our panelists introduce themselves in just a minute, but we do want to take a little time to just center ourselves and to recognize that the land that is known as the U.S. is stolen land. It is land of many indigenous folks who lived here, peoples who lived here for eons, for ages before anyone came and settled on any of the shores of this country. So I'm going to invite you to take a moment to acknowledge the realities of the land, because it informs our conversation and should inform the ways in which we vote and take action every day. So if you will, take a breath, settle in, and take a minute to consider your relationship with the land. This particular land acknowledgement has been adapted from one written by my colleague Rob Nelson, who also works at Vanderbilt. I have adapted it a little bit so that it is more generalized. You might want to take the time to find out which tribes and which peoples were on the land where you are today. For where I am and where Scarritt Bennett is, this was shared land. This was shared hunting grounds for Cherokee, Choctaw, Shawnee, and Creek nations, along with probably some other folks. This land was also part of the Trail of Tears, and so part of the deadly genocidal walk that many indigenous tribes who were forced out of the eastern part of the U.S. traveled through here. And it's important to just recognize that that is the reality. That's the fact of our land. So please join me. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live are the many indigenous peoples who originally cared for the land. We pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and that these and other peoples were forcibly removed through and from these lands. We stand in solidarity with the indigenous people who have been and continue to be connected to these lands. We also recognize the resistance, strength, and pride of Black, Brown, and other people of color whose ancestors worked, lived, and bled on this land without benefit or due compensation. Building a just world requires reckoning with these realities and working to strengthen our practices of solidarity at every turn. Thank you for taking that moment today and every day that you take it moving forward. I want to take a minute to just sort of do a quick reminder of how Scarritt Bennett approaches this work. Their work is informed by the framework of emotional justice, and Scarritt Bennett as an organization recognizes that that their work is to work as co-conspirators against all systems, including sometimes the legal and voting system, when it is unethical and it doesn't work, and when it causes harm. Some of that's going to come up today. Part of the work, part of the ways that Scarritt Bennett frames that work is that it is the job, the responsibility, the work of Black folks to spend their time healing from the realities of racial trauma. And it is the work of white folks to address systems and the violence of white supremacy, systems that we cause, harm that we cause independently, and the harm that our systems and our organizations and institutions cause. And that we can, in fact, use our positions of relative privilege to disrupt and dismantle and work against the things that cause all of us harm. And we're going to complicate all of that even more by naming all the other sorts of identities that are at play and the realities that are at play today. But part of this conversation is about calling out our own actions and the actions of others, the habits of violence that we perpetuate, so that we can call folks back in to deeper community and deeper relationship and deeper care for each other. I'll step on my soapbox. I don't believe that this world is all that we can do. I believe that we can build a world with far more justice, far more love, far more care, where people are not regularly used for other people's gain, and where people aren't regularly harmed or killed. So I am invested in building that world and hope that this conversation helps us do a little bit of that work. One last moment of reflection, and then we're going to dive into introductions. I'm going to invite you into meditation, reflection, prayer, however you want to think about that. I'm going to read a short prayer from Black Liturgies. So if you are on Instagram, I would highly encourage you to check out Black Liturgies. They're regularly coming up with prayers and reflections that are specific to these moments and that are often inspired by quotes, poetry, or other pieces of our lived experience. This particular prayer comes from, or is inspired by, a line of poetry by Nahira Wahid, and I invite you to listen however it makes sense or join me in prayer. God of the multitude, we praise you for being a God who contains a diversity of personhood in one. In your very being, you possess a sacred community where each is distinct and beautiful and necessary. Make our community like you, that we would no longer be content with the bland flavor of sameness, that we would no longer use language of unity and oneness as a veil for the suppression of voice, body, and culture. Be near to those who have offered up the particularity of their stories to bring about restoration, only to be met with accusations of divisiveness and unkindness. Lord, let our kindness be marked by telling the truth. And if division follows, let it be for our own protection. That you would lead us into spaces that see and honor that we are not the same, and it is very good. Amen. We'll dive into the multiplicities of this conversation, remembering that none of us have it all figured out, but we're on the journey, and we are on the journey with you. This conversation is nonpartisan, so we aren't going to be talking about trying to convince you to vote for any particular candidates, but we are going to get real about the issues. So with that in mind, I'm going to invite our panelists to introduce themselves, and as a way of introduction, ask you to tell us how this conversation of white women voting, how this topic impacts your life. And tell us a little bit about who you are. Arlene, I think you're going to kick us off.
Yeah, I'm Arlene Avakian. I'm a retired faculty member from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I'm 81 years old, just to position myself in the multi-generational collection we have here. Very glad to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. I am a child and grandchild of survivors and victims of the Armenian genocide, which was perpetrated against Armenians in 1915 by the Ottoman Empire. And I was born in the States, but this genocide, as much as I tried to run away from it, kept chasing me in one way or another. And it's been responsible for my worldview kind of through the civil rights movement. In other words, my involvement emotionally with the civil rights movement allowed me to look again at my history and the history of Armenians, which is something I didn't want to do, being raised in the 1950s when difference was not an interesting thing to be at all. So then the women's movement came around and changed my life again, as the civil rights movement had. And I became involved with women's studies at UMass, which is what we called it then. And I was one of the founders. And then I became the director. Well, actually the chair, which was, it became a department. And my goal from the beginning of my involvement with women's studies was try to bring race to the center. But this is a very difficult thing to do in the 1970s. The program began in 1974. So I was struggling, and you know, all of the people in women's studies were white, the students were white, the faculty were white. And there was maybe a course on Black women at the end of the semester. And usually people didn't get to that. So the message was, women's studies is about white women and there are others. That's not what I wanted to do. So then in 2001, I became the department chair, and my goal at that time was to make the department a majority of women of color working on women of color. And you know, you tend to think of Massachusetts as a blue state, right? With gay marriage, you know, all that stuff. However, the University of Massachusetts, which is a very progressive institution on many levels, is also quite a racist institution and a white institution. So I was a graduate student in the history department. The history department prided itself on being focused on American history. Until 10 years ago, there was not one course on slavery. Imagine that, right? So when I became chair, I said, okay, I'm looking around the university. I know that there is not one person, Black or white, teaching from their research on African-American women. There's about 1,300, 1,400 faculty, right? So it was my job, I thought, to hire someone who would do that. And we hired an amazing African-American historian, historian of African-American women. And my goal became to hire a majority women of color working on women of color, because my experience has told me, both in the women's movement and in women's studies, that white women can't be trusted. They cannot be trusted to center race in terms of intersectionality, race, class, gender, sexuality. All of these things are important, but mostly in the women's movement and in women's studies, gender has been privileged. So why did I want to do that? I wanted to do that because I want a different world, like Lindsey. I do not want to live in a world where some people are more important than other people. I do not want to live in a world that is structured by white supremacy, as the United States and most of the Western world is structured by white supremacy. It's not just individual whites, but the whole structure of the society. And I learned so much from James Baldwin, who reminds us that white people cannot grow up. We cannot become full adults until we recognize, I would say in this context, it's not a word I usually use, but the sins of genocide and slavery. We cannot do that. And he's absolutely brilliant on that. And I think that has brought us to this point in our national life. So these topics have shaped my life for most of my adult life. And it's not because I want to be an ally. It's a word I never used. It's a word I never liked, because I want this for myself. I want this for the next generation. I want this for the promise of America. But it's a promise of America that was constructed within slavery and genocide and economic exploitation. So that's my story.
Thank you, Arlene, and thank you for giving us an arc of your life and sort of so many pieces that you pulled together for that. Who's ready to go next? Stephanie, do you mind going next?
Not at all, thank you. My name is Reverend Stephanie Kendall. I'm coming to you from New York City, which was once home to the Lenape and Wappinger people. So thank you for that land recognition, as that is such an important part of this work that we do together. This work, primarily, well, this conversation is really important for me because, one, I hope that it models the way in which white women, white people can hold each other accountable, have these hard and faithful and courageous conversations that are so pertinent to our life as a whole, but so integral to what's happening right now in our world. And so hopefully, I'm grateful to be asked to be a part of this, so that I'm hoping that it models a sense of community and accountability that we owe and deserve, both to and with each other. I, as someone who follows Jesus, who is a faith leader, I understand our gospel text to be one of liberation and justice. And so if I am one to follow Jesus with that vision, I expect it to be a part of my entire life, which means knowing who my neighbor is. And it also means knowing how my vote affects those neighbors. And so I look at my vote and my privilege to vote as an extension of how I love my neighbor, how I am called to recognize who that neighbor is, especially in spaces that have, especially in spaces where we have not named our neighbor well. I guess is a way in which I want to put that, that we have named our neighbor, especially for white women, we've leaned more into the white side of that within the woman side of that, or of the people of color side of that. And so I think to just make sure that we deconstruct who we are in a way that is life-giving to all people. And that is my call to ministry, and that is my call to understand this work, and hopefully a way in which we can all start to see the repercussions and the responsibilities of our vote.
Thank you so much. I'm particularly going to hold on to that idea of faithful conversations and what does that really mean? Because I think where we're going is something very different from what we've been taught. Jolie, do you mind hopping in?
Sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Jolie Grace Wareham. Thank you to everybody who is tuning into this really important conversation. I'm really happy to be here today. I approach this conversation from a background of many years of electoral politics and government work. And so I'm kind of thinking about a lot of things in the political space. And I know that's where a lot of our heads are right now. So kind of what I wrote down a few notes here. I come at this with an electoral perspective. So I do a lot of work with campaigns. And so I like to look at a lot of statistics. And I often find ourselves when we think about strategies for talking to voters or trying to engage people in the political process and engage people to vote, we're using statistics and we're coming from a framework that is racist and it is upholding white supremacy in a lot of ways. And so as somebody who does a lot of work with electoral strategy, I am excited to be having this conversation today because it's important to kind of break away from the strategies that we use because they are molded by not great structures. And so it's important for us to be thinking about how do we be co-conspirators and how do we further anti-racist efforts as people who are trying to get people elected. So that is something that I'm very excited to be kind of thinking about today. I also hold several leadership positions with different women's civic organizations. And so in general, a lot of my professional life is done trying to engage women in civic processes. And so it is very interesting to me about the ways why certain women are engaged in politics in the first place or not engaged, but specifically why do white women interact with politics and take part in politics or choose to sit out. And then I also, kind of with this work, I guess I'll name my age. I'm 25. And so I also, I guess today I'm bringing that kind of perspective as a millennial as well. But we really do need to get young white women to be voting as well. And so if there's possibly some ways we can talk about that, I think young people don't engage in politics as much as younger folk or as older folks. And we often don't understand the ways that not sitting out and not taking part in politics actually does affect us. And specifically, we need to be training young white women to be taking part in these civic processes and thinking about the weight of our choosing to sit out. And again, with that, kind of thinking about the ways that kind of people maybe who are more millennials versus not kind of how we engage with the civic processes. A lot of my work is often trying to figure out ways to bridge activism with institutional structures of politics. And so we often think about, I come from I'm definitely like an in the system person, I guess some people would say. And we often have conversations about how do we bring the ideas of the people who are marching or the people who are who are coming from more activist spaces, how do we bring those ideas into the structures that exist? Because if I hold any kind of power within a structure that needs to be changed, I need to figure out how to leverage, my ability to make that change. And so those are all things that I'm kind of thinking about today and kind of bringing, those are kind of some of the backgrounds that I'm bringing and how this conversation relates to my work. So thanks for having me.
Lillian, that leaves you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lillian Lammers, and I am zooming in from Memphis, Tennessee, which was originally the land of the Quapaw and Chickasaw people. I am an associate pastor here at a church that is multi-generational, multiracial. Since 1991 has been an open and affirming and a just peace church, and since the summer of 2020 has declared itself to be an anti-racist congregation and has developed a set of commitments that go along with that position. And I am 41 years old, and a mother of 3 young children, ages 3, 2, and 10 months. And so that identity is rather prominent for me right now, perhaps because of the sleep deprivation and crying, but we'll see if that identity shifts at all as my children get a little bit older. But I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation, in part because I think one of the things we're doing here is shattering a myth, which is that when you walk into the polling place, you're voting for yourself. You know, this idea that whose best interest are you voting for? Well, mine. It's never a me. It's never an I. It is always a we. You are always voting on behalf of a community and on behalf of identities. And I don't think we talk about that enough. And so I'm eager for us to get to dive into that, because I feel like having those uninterrogated spaces of these questions of who am I voting for, who am I voting with, that's where a lot of sinister things can lie. And so I'm eager for us to kind of air out some of these things through our conversation together.
Well, then let's dive right in. It's almost like you just set me up. Thank you. It was perfect. We have heard it said thousands of times, right, for years and across platforms, that white women often vote against their own best interests, is one way to think about part of what Lillian's naming. And in doing that, vote in ways that directly harm Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color, harm immigrants, harm LGBTQI plus folks, and more. I'm curious if you all can name some of the ways that you've seen this pattern play out, and name some of the impacts of this habit of voting. Anybody ready to hop in? Go ahead, Arlene. Oh, you're muted. Can I unmute you? No. There we go.
Okay. I'd like to put a historical perspective on this and take it back to suffrage. The struggle, the 50, well, probably more than 50 years of struggle to get the vote. And this struggle has been characterized as a white woman's movement. And it is absolutely true that white women were often segregationists in their refusal to allow Black women to join their suffrage clubs. It is true that some of the big names in suffrage used racist arguments for the vote. Carrie Chapman Catt, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, you know, the names that we know. All of that is true. However, Stanton and Anthony wrote the history of the women's suffrage movement, and they wrote Black women out of it, basically. So the first Women's Rights Convention was in 1837, not 1848, as they wrote. And it was an interracial meeting. And there were Black women's suffrage clubs all over the country, and Black women struggled for the vote. We did a conference many years ago on African-American women in the vote, and the dates for that conference were 1837 to 1965. And as most of you know, suffrage was passed in 1920, 100 years ago. But for the great majority of Black people, they were not able to access the franchise until 1965, when the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act was passed. So I think that's kind of our history as white women, and our history as white women also within slavery. There's a mythology that women are kinder, women are, would be against slavery. Well, sometimes women were the worst perpetrators of slavery. Women owned slaves. Martha Washington owned slaves. George Washington's slaves were Martha Washington's slaves. The Hemmings of Monticello actually belonged to Jefferson's wife. So, it's not a good history. There are very, very few exceptions of white women standing up against slavery. So when people say that white women vote against themselves, They voted against themselves in terms of gender, but not in terms of race. And I think if we just look at white women as women, we're not understanding that every single one of us is in a matrix of identities that intersect with each other. So I'm Armenian American, I'm a lesbian, I'm middle class, I'm white. All of those inform each other, you know. And just a more recent example, in California, in 1996, white women voted against affirmative action, through which they would have benefited greatly, but they voted with their race. They voted, maybe some of them with their men, but they voted in terms of white people. So, and this works also with other groups. So I just read the other day in the Times that Latino men are only, Biden is ahead with Latino men only by 8%, which is way lower than any other group of color, or male or female, you know, and that's because he appeals to them in terms of gender. So that's what we have to look at when we look at white women, this history and intersectionality.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing, like, helping us see the long arc of this, right? So we can have a clear sense of where our roots are and sort of know the complications of it. Just real quick, I do want to encourage folks to put questions in the chat. I know that with Arlene giving us history, we're going to have questions. And as we start to bring up more things, please put your questions in the chat, and Scarritt Bennett staff will make sure that we get to those toward the end. Other folks, how have you seen this idea of voting against, white women voting against their best interests show up?
I'll go. So I kind of mentioned that I'm a mom, and that's a newer identity that I carry. But it's been one that has been very much in my mind as we've gone through really the last 5 or 6 years in thinking about politics. When I walk into the booth and cast my vote, and my identity is as a mother, I have to be really careful that I'm not doing that just as a white mother, but that I'm thinking more broadly about what it means to be a mother. So, you know, being a pastor in a multiracial church, am I casting a vote that also aligns with Black mothers who have concerns about the safety of their children encountering police in our city? Am I casting a vote on behalf of Latina mothers who, 545 children who we still can't find their parents after we strip them away from their mothers and put them in cages? So knowing that if I'm going to claim that identity of motherhood, it needs to be a more holistic identity of motherhood, and it can't just be this narrow view of my identity as a cisgender. You know, we want to talk about LGBTQ plus mothers, wondering what's going to happen with future Supreme Court rulings, and are they going to have the same rights as families, as a family like mine, where there is a mother and a father. Just knowing that if I'm going to claim that identity and say that that's something that's important to me as I evaluate all of the issues and political options at play right now, that I have to think beyond just this narrow sliver of what that identity means to me. And I think for other identities, also doing that sort of opening up and broadening and stepping outside of this narrow space that I hold has been really important to me when thinking about politics in recent years.
You're helping to illuminate sort of one of the responses to this, but what in so many ways we've been trained to do is to say our responsibility is to care for our own, right? Mm-hmm. Whoever our kids are, whoever our biologically determined and like governmentally recognized family is, those are the folks that we care about. And Stephanie sort of already gave us this framework of thinking about re-understanding what it means to think about neighbor, right? And expanding or maybe blowing apart the myth of a neighbor that we had been taught. And you're helping us to sort of think about that. Thank you. Stephanie, I wonder if you want to go next.
Sure, absolutely. Like I think all of us, where it's recognizing that there is an intersection of our identities, and in that same way, one of the ways in which I've seen white women kind of show up in this space is by the actual like staying home and not voting. We have that, and I want to make sure I have the statistic right. So Julie Grace, please hop on in if I don't. But I think the exit polls of 2016 showed that of white women voters, 52% went for the current administration, right? And so, but that doesn't speak to the actual amount of women that leaned into their privilege of not actually voting. And so I think that when we have to, one, have these conversations so that we deconstruct and demystify who is voting, who are white women, and what's happening. Because on paper, I myself am a straight, white, employed, educated pastor, or Christian, let's just call it that. And there are a lot of me's out there, right? And we inhabit lots of different spaces, lots of different privileges, and we vote in a lot of different ways. And so if I want to take back this narrative of what it means to be a white woman Christian voter, I need to do so with faithfulness to not only who I am as a Christian, but who I am as my faith calls me to be in relationship to other people. That there is a need to understand that my vote is one that has been fought for, is a privilege to have, and thus is a tool of my faith to make sure that all of God's creation are cared for with equity and justice, and that equity and justice is not something that we can buy our way into, but is something that we need to really inhabit. And one of the ways in which we can inhabit right now is to encourage others to vote, to have the hard conversations that a lot of us don't want to have, particularly with family or friends or our congregations or all sorts of things, about just what it means to show up for your neighbor. So.
Go ahead. You're ready. Go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just listening to y'all talk, I'm hearing some things. I mean, and I don't know how to do this, to be honest. I mean, there are no right answers and best answers here, because we're trying to figure out what our problems are, and then we have to figure out how to fix them. But we really have to change the perception of voting and just civic engagement in general, like in our country, but especially among us white women. And I know that sounds like the most obvious statement, but we need to really think about, what does that mean? And I think it's important to name in this conversation today just how polarized our country is when it comes to politics. And voting is not an act of humanity. It's not an act of thinking about your neighbor, or for a lot of people, voting is not even a civic duty. It is an act to go against the other side, or it's an act to try to win. And when voting is framed as an element of our polarized society, it's very hard to think about voting as an element of humanity, really. And that's what it really needs to be. And so I'm trying to think about ways that we as white women can try to have more conversations like that, with our peers, even standing in line when we are, you probably are gonna be making some friends when you're going to go vote, because you're gonna be in line for like an hour. Might be interesting to even talk to somebody just about why they're going to vote. And I think more often than not in our society right now, it's to get somebody out of office or to get somebody to win. And it's not necessarily to make somebody else's life better. And it's not even always to make our own lives better. I think it's really important to think about, our privilege as white women, and how little elections really affect our daily lives sometimes. Yes, they affect us in a lot of ways, but they're not going to affect us in ways as strong as our Black and brown sisters. They're just not. Recently, I was talking to a friend, and I was, talking about this current election, and he was like, well, it's not going to affect you that much, no matter what. And I couldn't necessarily disagree. And there are a lot of ways that we obviously know, judge appointments and different appointments, they affect our lives a lot. But us as white women, it's not going to affect us as much as other people. And so I think we need to make voting so much less of a of a personal kind of thing. And that's how I see it a lot right now. I also do want to just note that, you mentioned, Stephanie, the statistics from 2016. I think we're going to see those statistics look quite different this election in a couple weeks. But I want us to remember that just because it might look different, that's not good enough. And we need to be thinking about ways to expedite that process of kind of changing the way we're doing that. So I think that statistic is a really interesting one to look at as well. So thank you for bringing that up.
Totally, Grace. As you were talking, so I've been having these conversations with my family and realized just this year that what I take is very personal because I understand who it's impacting in my life. My parents still live in such a way, my family still lives in such a way that they don't feel that impact. It feels like it's just a political act. And so you name me that, I'm like, yes, that. And it's fascinating to realize that for me, it does, as a queer woman who has family in a whole host of different formats and of a whole host of different humans, like I know that the world and the way that it's set up will impact me and will impact those I love very directly. And exactly what you just said, the way the system is set up, folks who are closest to those in power, so particularly white men with money and property and who are able-bodied and all those sorts of things, right? Christian in particular, or like sort of Christian adjacent, Christian trying to be, I'm not sure, right? Like, and the folks who, when we had this conversation before, we talked about white women as sort of being just a few rungs below and sort of like looking up and being like, well, if we can just make sure that we keep close enough to where power is, then we'll be okay. And what we're trying to sort of shift that conversation is like, what actually happens when we actually make our neighbors, our community, we see that it's not here, it's everyone else who's sort of with us and maybe socioculturally experiencing even more of the oppression. And like you're making it clear that there is this weird distinction between like it's a political act and like no, it's a real lived impact act. Absolutely. So with that in mind, you all sort of started to name this, right? We have talked about being or implied that we are trained into certain ways of thinking and being and doing, trained into ways of enacting womanhood and what it means to be a white woman in particular. I will say, like, how are we indoctrinated is the way I would think about it. And so often those forms of enculturation go unnamed and unexamined, but we cannot do that any longer. And in fact, bringing them into the light and naming them overtly allows us to deal with them, right? So what are some of the ways that you have seen that enculturation happen that are harmful? What are some of the impacts in your own life? Arlene, you're already off mute. You ready?
Sure. Well, you know, I grew up in the 50s. So the things that the women's movement brought out were never named for me. I felt them when my brother was born. I felt the difference. You know, I always say I became a feminist when I was 6.5 and my brother was born. But it's not enough. You know, it's not enough to look at ourselves as women. It's just not enough because none of us is just women. So what's not named now, although the current occupant of the White House has made it easier to name because he's so blatant in his views. So what's not named is how we are privileged by race. And we're white women, and that matters. A little story. As you know, I'm an old white woman, and I drive fast. I've always driven fast. So I was in my neighborhood here, and I was going around a curve that was dangerous, at twice the speed limit. The speed limit was 20, I was going 40. And this is the third time this has happened to me. So a cop is behind me. So I said to myself, okay, be the old white lady. So it comes to the thing, you know, the car, and I roll down the window and I say, oh, officer, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. You know, I just wasn't thinking, and I just got this car a few months ago and the car likes to go fast. He didn't even give me a warning. didn't even give me a warning. And that's happened to me 3 or 4 times, mostly on country roads. And I always think, what if I had been Black? What if I had been Latino? And it's not just men. You know, Sandra Bland was stopped for a traffic infraction and she ended up dead, you know. So this is, as white women, we have to make this visible, because our whiteness is naturalized, because we live in a white supremacist society and it's around us all the time. It takes work to identify it. And so that's what I would say about our, you know, the women's movement has made our, you know, and it's old now, you know, even women's studies is 45 years old at UMass or something like that. My arithmetic is really bad. But the women's movement exposed some of that, you know, and Hillary Clinton's, you know, run for the president. There's a lot of stuff that we know as women. It's not all okay, as the current going to be the new Supreme Court judge shows us, you know, it's not okay. And I really disagree. I think voting matters for everybody. It really matters. We think it doesn't matter, but I lived before abortion was legal, you know, and now it's been chipped away, and that it matters for everybody. But what hasn't, you know, in the last few years, and I have to say Black Lives Matter and all these wonderful groups that have been demonstrating are making more visible. Since this presidency, more and more people are talking about whiteness, but still it's a struggle to recognize it and to see our history in whiteness and our everyday privilege.
And some of the things you talk about, naturalizing or sort of normalizing of whiteness, right? Like you were trusted, you were understood as sort of an innocent in that moment, right? And you're giving us this one tiny thing, but that carte blanche, that gets spread across all of our experiences, right? This, oh, you were nice and you were sweet and you weren't a threat because you were white and you were a woman, right? And that shows up.
Yes, and our assumption as whites, when we hear that, say, you know, a Black person was abused by the police, because our experience as whites is, well, if they were just nicer, or if they didn't just do this, and if they didn't just do that, you know, I mean, it's so much in our thinking. That's just one small example. Yeah.
I wonder if the rest of y'all can, yep, Stephanie's ready to chime in, which is perfect. Just a reminder that we're trying to keep this conversation as nonpartisan as possible. So issues, not candidates. Stephanie.
Absolutely. Well, I just wanted to kind of name a little bit about that whiteness. I really appreciate Arlene bringing up, is that, you know, how much harm our Christian spaces have actually done, and how much we have perpetuated white supremacy in the fact that, you know, how many of our churches still have a white Jesus up? How many of our churches, how often are you reminded that, you know, our scriptures are written by and for people of color? I mean, like, they're the stories of the rich and beautiful stories of traditions of people of color, and how have we perpetuated our own lens of white supremacy and whiteness into those stories and narratives, and that there's a lot of harm that is done in that. And so it just, when women vote against their own interest, it directly relates to how often they hear about the imago Dei as people of color, as women, as, you know, who actually gets to embody that image of God in a way that is valued in a society, which is why this conversation is important. It's why, you know, yes, we can be, you know, churches have to be nonpartisan. I get that. And so, but it is okay to say, you know, we got to vote. We have to talk about who and how our vote matters and affects, and to do so in a way that deconstructs the privileges of the whiteness that has inhabited the identity of Christ for Christians and or of God writ large, and who we even allow to be a person of faith in this country, right? So often we talk about religious people, but what that means is like straight, white, property-owning men. Yeah, and so there's just a lot of that like we can't undervalue how much our church spaces influence this understanding of race, of patriarchy of white supremacy in this election process.
Absolutely. You named some of the realities around even religious freedom acts and like work to protect religious freedom, which we see around LGBTQI issues, around abortion, around access to healthcare, and historically, actually, the first Supreme Court case was actually specifically about race. Right? There's a barbecue place, like Pig Porker, I can't remember it. Sorry. Pig leg porker, piggy porker. I think it's piggy porker, where the first case is actually a white man whose Christianity is tied to white supremacy, and he doesn't want to serve Black folks in his restaurant. So when we look at the history of religious freedom acts, they tie directly back to white supremacy, and even now they still prioritize a very small understanding of what it means to be religious, and all other religious beliefs don't get protected by those acts, right? Lillian, Julie Grace, one of you ready to hop in?
Sure, I'll hop in. So I am not originally from the South, and now have spent about half of my adult life down here. And so it has been interesting to see how the notion of how white women are acculturated to behave and what topics are okay to talk about in, shared spaces looks very different. I think there was some sort of acculturation to be a nice person and to be a nice woman. I was not brought up with the sort of notion of to be a lady. That is something that was new when I moved to the South. And we talked when we opened up this conversation about how it's not polite to talk about these things and to sort of bring more light into what it means when we walk into the voting booth. And I think a lot of that down here in particular is around some of these things that we've already named, that like, well, at the end of the day, it's not that big of a difference whichever way it goes because I'm a white woman. So I'd rather not talk about it with my neighbor because I don't know where she stands, because I still want to be friends with her the day after election day. I don't want her to think I'm not nice by actually saying, hey, what are you thinking about this election season? And what are the issues that are important to you? Like that's too uncomfortable. And that's not nice, ladylike, conversation. And so that's been a really eye-opening transition for me in sort of now that I've been down here for a long period of time, to see how that acculturation is operative when you want to bring up difficult topics that folks are uncomfortable having conversations about. And I think just like Reverend Stephanie, I think I have a lot of personal frustration about the importance placed on white Christian women, or even just white Christian voters. But that really only boils down to a very, very few number of issues, most prominently where you stand on abortion. That's how I see it play out most publicly. Sometimes we're also talking about marriage equality and full rights for LGBTQ folks, but more often than not, I see it just come down to that one single issue. And for me, we've mentioned a couple times in our prior conversations about this white Jesus that everybody walks around with, but that not only changes Jesus's embodiment and Jesus's own racial identity, it also mutes Jesus entirely, because Jesus was somebody who always had a preferential option for the poor and marginalized. So if you are going to say that you are a Christian voter, then you need to walk into that polling place and cast a vote in the best interest of the poor and the marginalized, because that is 100% what we know Jesus would have done. So this sort of notion of a Christian voter is so far removed from the actual teachings of Jesus. And we really, really need to sort of shatter that myth of what a white Christian voter is, because it ain't what they say it is.
Jolie Grace, wrap us up.
Yeah. So I'm like thinking about the way that I was kind of socialized and just kind of the way that I was taught to talk about some of these issues. I'm also not from the South. I'm originally from outside of Chicago. However, I went to college in Memphis, and college was honestly some of the first times I was having real conversations about the civil rights movement and about racism. Where I'm from in Chicago, I don't want to say a blanket statement about northern cities, but my experience being from a suburb of Chicago was that you don't talk about race. That's rude, that's inappropriate. I was taught that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, and that had nothing to do with slavery. But I was taught all about the women's suffrage movement and how, you know, Susan B. Anthony refused to eat in jail. And those are some of like the real strong memories about my social studies education. And so thinking about, I think it's hard for me to think about the way that I was socialized as a white woman without thinking about my education growing up. I think that where I come from and the social studies education that I had taught me that it was okay and it was necessary to talk about sexism and feminism, but it was inappropriate to talk about race. And so it wasn't until I moved to the South where I felt like I could and needed to have some of these conversations. And so I think that is a way, I think that as is demonstrative of the way that a lot of white women are socialized as well. We think that, like you mentioned, Lindsey, kind of how we were talking about how our society really props up and gives most privilege to white men, and us as white women are kind of just one rung away from that. And so it's almost more accepted for us to talk about that discrepancy, that one thing that we aren't privileged about versus the things that our neighbors are not privileged about. And I think that that's important as well. I think when we're thinking about ourselves as voters, another thing, I think, you know, we're thinking about women as voters. I think we also need to be thinking about women in leadership positions, both in and out of politics. You know, we often disregard the issues, women's issues, and other women if it means that we personally get to sit at the table. So we'll take a seat at the table even if we don't like what's being served at the table, just because we want to have a voice. Because we as white women are taught that if you just had a little bit more power, then you'd be the ideal, what our society props up as most privileged. And so I think we see that a lot. I think if you think about who are the figureheads, even right now, of some of the people in politics or even in business or something like that, that is really promoting white patriarchy, those are women oftentimes. And so we need to be holding those women accountable, but also we need to be wondering why we as white women, when we see a woman candidate or if we see a woman business leader, why do we want to support them if they aren't supporting what's really important to us and our neighbors? And we need to dig deep and think about, you know, why me as a white woman, I see a woman in power and I want to have that kind of power too, right? So we want to do what we can to support them. But that doesn't end up actually being supportive of what's really important to us and our neighbors. And so I think there's a lot of complexities in the ways that we're all conditioned as white women, kind of stemming from the ways that we received our education, but also the way that we perceive women in leadership as well now today.
Absolutely. Thank y'all for weaving so many pieces together. And a couple other things that sort of are bubbling underneath what y'all are naming are the ways in which these enculturations are ways to also control us and to limit us, right? And to limit our vision. I think particularly the ways in which keeping a white woman pure or maintaining her innocence has been used also as ways to control women, but specifically also then to enact violence, particularly on Black men, or if we're looking at bathroom bills, right, against Black and brown trans folks, right? So there are so many ways also in which the system is using a particular way of protecting us and making us special, or I don't know. There's other ways to think about that. That is also then perpetuating violence and used to perpetuate violence against the folks that we love, that we want to be in community with, right? So naming these realities and exposing them, we're going to do the last question, and we'll go to questions from the audience. But exposing these realities that we're starting to name out loud, we are at least starting to call them into question, which gives us the opportunity to figure out something new and do something different. So I'm wondering what it is that we're called to change. What are we responsible for? Who are we responsible to? Maybe just like a short answer on that one, because we'll probably circle back around to it a couple more times. But what are we called to?
So I'll go.
We have to change the world. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Arlene. It's
Come
fine.
on.
We have to change the world. You know, we have to change the world to make it, to live up to what Black people have been saying for so long, to live up to the dream that has never been fulfilled, you know. And I'm actually working with a nonpartisan group called the Movement Photo Project, which funds grassroots organizations of youth and in communities of color to get people to understand that voting makes a difference, but these are people that are embedded in their communities so they can talk to their neighbors and do relational organizing. Movement Photo Project, it's amazing group, and it has given me hope in this very scary time.
Good, Lillian.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think we have to see past the end of our noses. So if you've noticed, if you've been paying attention to the current election season, there's been some pretty pointed comments toward white women, particularly suburban white women, calling out, you know, we want to maintain your safety, and using all kinds of really coded language that really has some horrible racial underpinnings. But if safety is a concern for white women, asking the question of what is the best way to respond to those things that do give you concern? Is it through a criminal justice system that disproportionately kills and incarcerates people of color? Or is it through education and community opportunity and access and all of these other things that could be other approaches to maybe addressing whatever that thing is that makes you feel unsafe? So if there is a valid concern there that drives somebody's vote, giving them a little more opportunity to explore what the best response to that particular concern may be that doesn't do harm against our Black and brown siblings.
Stephanie, Julie, Grace?
Yeah, I think we need to think about the things that make us comfortable and think about why they're making us comfortable. And we need to, when people tell us that the election really isn't going to affect us personally that much, we need to say, yes, it will, because it's going to affect my friends, my neighbors, my family. I think we need to get uncomfortable and we need to have more conversations with each other, you know. And I think we also need to think about the things that we think are normal and understand why we're normalizing certain things. And I know I'm speaking really generally, but I think we just all need to go inside of ourselves and think about, you know, I think that a lot of this work is definitely having conversations with each other, but it's really having conversations with yourself as well. Just like we're doing now, thinking back to the way we were raised or the way that we're socialized. And I think the first step is really going inside of ourselves and figuring out why we do the things we do, why we feel comfortable in certain situations and why we don't.
Absolutely.
I guess it's me. Yes, I think it goes back for white Christians to really open up our understanding and talk about openly who gets to inhabit the image of God in our scriptures, in our conversations, in our prayers at the table with our family. There's a lot of conversations happening that really point to that. Some of our communities have never thought of God as a woman or God as a person of color. And I think that that's really, it influences everything. It also just makes me want to be like, you know, I am the loudmouth daughter of a loudmouth mother of a really polite grandmother. And the ways in which white women have used niceness as both a weapon for self-preservation and as a shield for our own discomfort needs to be addressed and named, and to do so in these types of spaces and openly, and to, I don't know, to lift each other up when we start to see this work being done, because we have been enculturated to be so nice, to say like, yes, I see the work that you are doing. I want to be alongside you, and let's do, you know, come to this work together. Ask people, what is your plan to vote? What is your understanding of your relationship to your ballot? What measures do you care about? I think just asking, we forget to be curious. We forget to be curious about what is on our ballot, to be curious about the ways in which these votes affect other people beyond, you know, as Reverend Lillian said, beyond the tip of our own nose. Who is, you know, if you, as Lindsey asked us to, you know, kind of center ourselves in the land that isn't even ours, right? It's all connected, and we have to be able to get out of our own privileged way and name the ways in which our whiteness, our womanness, our participation in patriarchy, our participation in racism are all connected, and specifically point us towards this moment in time to make the change.
How do we disrupt the tyranny of niceness, both for our own liberation and for the liberation of everyone that we call neighbor, we call family, we call beloved? Reverend Charisma, I'm going to invite you back to the screen to help us navigate some more questions, if you don't mind.
Awesome. Thank you. So yeah, we do have several questions from the audience. This first question, I'm going to reframe it a little bit so that it represents a nonpartisan conversation, but I think it's also a larger conversation about white women being in relationship and in community with white men and holding white men accountable. The ways in which white women tend to protect and also willing to ignore bad behavior and characteristics that put everyone at risk. And so to have a particular candidate who runs for a particular office, you're willing to ignore, right, the ways in which the candidate has spoken against or even towards, right, women and others, right, whether it's sexual assault, right, whether it's ways in which they have dealt with women's bodies in the past, right? But I also think ways women are in community with men, average everyday men, and how white women are willing to ignore, right, bad behavior and willing to protect white men, right, willing to save them, right, when white men are dangerous. Right now in this country, FBI are saying we are literally ignoring, right, the major threat that is at hand right here. This is grown home terrorist attacks that are happening right now, white men. So let's talk about how white women ought to be holding white men accountable, calling white men out, and stop protecting white men, and also stop electing white men that does not represent what it means for women's rights and women's safety as a whole. And that's for anyone.
Well, I think part of it is just that women need to run for office. A part of it is that, you know, you can't vote out or vote for non-white men if they're the only ones that are running. And so I don't know, hear this as an invitation to all of you women watching out there, particularly women of color, although this is not on, I don't want this to be on any one people, but the more diverse of a candidate pool that we have, the better represented that we will be in our elected leadership, and it'll show us the opportunities that we have present to actually see ourselves represented at the highest level. But you've got to start, you've just got to do it. We've got to empower we've got to empower people to take that first step and say, I will run.
Mm-hmm.
I particularly have been thinking, I saw an Instagram post that invited, it was actually from someone who had been a sex worker who was talking about they moved into a job as a dishwasher and were getting more sexual harassment experiences and sexual assault experiences working in the restaurant industry. The question asked people who have been servers, which I have done food service for a large portion of my life. And I started to think through all my jobs, and I have like 3 jobs out of like 20 where I've not experienced sexual harassment, generally from management, generally from men. And the ways in which I came to normalize it and just be like, oh, it's just a part of the job. It's just part of a thing, right? And it was infuriating and heartbreaking to me to see how I had done that to myself and had just sort of bought into it. And I think a piece of like pushing back against white men in particular is just starting to like break open my own like sense of what I will put up with. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's not, I'm going to call you out overtly because you just did this thing. Sometimes all I'm going to do is throw you a glance. Sometimes I'm going to turn around and be like, what the did you just do? But like starting to find all of those small ways to do that is helping me also think about how I do it in the big ways.
I'd just like to, you know, remind us all that white supremacy is a huge issue in this culture, but so is patriarchy. You know, and it's dangerous for women to go against patriarchy. No, it's dangerous. And women sometimes see, I mean, I think in order to be whole, in order to be yourself, in order to understand the world, you have to understand both patriarchy and white supremacy. Otherwise, you're deluded, you know. But, you know, think about Germany between the wars and you know, German women voted for Hitler. And they were in very bad economic straits. And they didn't want to challenge what they thought would give them security. And I think that white women are all often deluded to think that patriarchy will save them. Whereas, and I want to acknowledge the challenging patriarchy can be dangerous and often is. You know, I'm in a wonderful group of activists working for MVP, but there's sexism in this group, you know, and if I call it out, I'm going to get attacked. I do, you know, because I've been around the block and I'm old, and I'm going to do it, but the danger is there.
Thank you for that. I agree, the danger is there, but I also think we need to speak to the need to be in relationship with white men, right? I think oftentimes that willing to protect white men is because we're in relationship with them, and we don't want to acknowledge that here's my friend who's a racist, right? And to acknowledge that he's a racist is also to acknowledge that I perpetuate, participate, and make way for racists in my own community and space. Right, let's be clear.
And there are fathers, our brothers, our sons.
That's right. That absolutely. So it's a reflection of me. That's right. This is a related question to particularly the reverends, the preachers on the panel. Actually, they named you Reverend Stephanie. You are preaching justice, and I assume that Reverend Dr. Lillian is also. But what are white male preaching as it relates to justice? Who is calling them out and in? So how, and I would suggest particularly with this panel here, not just preachers, but men in leadership, right? How are we calling men in leadership, men in preaching roles, pastoring roles, but in leadership roles who are not doing this work? Who are calling them out to call them back in? Reverend Stephanie.
Hopefully everyone, but we know that that's not true. And so it's, you know, it starts with this. It starts exactly with naming that there is a problem, that who has spoken, who has been given the microphone for far too long is still white men. For me in particular, it's about making sure that, you know, the illustrations that I use, things that I share, so how I talk about relationship to men in authority is grounded in, at least for me, the gospel message of liberation and understanding. One of my favorite things to teach is, you know, the Jezebel of Revelation, who all we know of her is that she kept preaching, and that the author of Revelation says to this, you know, to Thyatira, you keep listening to her. She's saying something. That's why they keep listening to her. And yet the response there is against her own personhood. And so, but she keeps going, and there is a fortitude and a courage there that I hope Christians can embody to call out the patriarchal and empirical structures that have perpetuated systems of oppression and hate. And but it starts with the simple act of knowing who you are and who you are called to be in this world and in relationship to other people, and to lean deeply into that truth so that we speak truth to power in ways that can affect change.
Does anyone else want to answer that question?
I will. So it's certainly not an easy thing to speak that truth, particularly when, I don't know how old you are, Reverend Stephanie, but I think we're probably around the same place. So younger women clergy often have to work really hard to sort of validate their own ministerial authority and identities. So it can be hard to push back against perhaps more established white male clergy. I am fortunate that in my tradition, we have gone past naming these dynamics as problematic and are now building that accountability and that calling out into our actual systems. So in addition to every 3 years having to do a boundary awareness training to make sure that we all have healthy boundaries for relationships and sexual boundaries, we now every 3 years have to do racial justice training so that we can be sure that we are not misappropriating texts or preaching with either overt or covert messaging of white supremacy. But I also think that we can't be afraid to invalidate the teachings of white male clergy if they are not true to the gospel, which is a message of liberation for all people, and particularly to people who have experienced oppression. So I think we have to continue to name who we know Jesus to be, the truths of our faith, and call out folks who are not preaching the gospel as it exists.
Reverend Charisma, can I hop in?
Yeah.
You named this just a minute ago, and I want to highlight it because it comes into this conversation. And because Arlene named that it can be dangerous, and we're naming that it's necessary, and so the reality is our job is to hold both of those things. And so there are call outs where you're just not screaming, maybe screaming, just saying there's nothing about this. These actions, these behaviors are violent. There's nothing redeemable about these behaviors. There might be something redeemable about the person, but the behaviors cannot go without consequence. And sometimes it's my job to be in relationship with that person, and sometimes it's not my job, depending. But then there are other people in which it is my parents, my extended family, right? I have some white male friends who it is my job to maintain relationships with them, even when they screw up. In part because I have to recognize that people are maintaining relationships with me when I screw up. And that is literally the only reason that I'm in this conversation right now, is because of the amount of energy, sometimes voluntarily given and sometimes taken, that people have invested in me, particularly Black and brown women.
That's right.
I want to name how we are here. Mm-hmm. That is how. And so it is also my responsibility to continue to be in relationship with people who are quote unquote problematic, mm-hmm. because that is how we help people shift, right? People have co-journeyed with us, and we are responsible also to co-journey with some people. Not with everyone. You don't have to maintain an abusive relationship, but we do have to show up in those spaces and keep pushing.
Mm-hmm. Particularly when we talk about elected officials, right? How to hold them accountable, right? What it means to hold our elected officials accountable. So let's talk a little bit about that. Jolie Grace, I want to invite you to come in. What it means and what does it look like once, these elected officials are in office? What does it look like for white men to hold them accountable?
Oh, that is a tough question, honestly. I've been sitting here thinking, as a young woman in politics, I hold a small elected office myself. And when you try to hold somebody accountable, like a white man accountable, or, we deal with sexism and sexual harassment all the time, in this work. And when you try, you sometimes actually get a lot of backlash from fellow white women. Mm-hmm. And I want to note that. Because, I've been sitting here thinking, there are a lot of people that I would love to call out, that I have to interact with all the time. And it's really difficult to figure out how to go about doing that. Because if I were to call out a white man for doing something, namely sexual harassment to a friend or myself or something like that, like just sexism, you risk losing not only the support of that man, who you might quote unquote need to get into a higher level of leadership so you can actually make more of an impact. So it's a constant catch-22. You want to be able to leverage the role that you might be in to call somebody out, but you also risk losing any kind of leverage you ever have if you do call that person out. And so, but also you're at risk of losing the support of a lot of fellow women when you do something like that. And so I don't know how to quite answer your question simply about what it looks like when that happens, because oftentimes when somebody calls out a white man for doing something like that, it turns into a huge news story, or it turns into you never hearing from that woman again because she was kind of blackballed for something. And so I think what we really need to be doing, Arlene, you were talking about how, scary and how risky it is to do this stuff. We have to, and we need to engage other women, or if we see a woman trying to call somebody out, we need to not say, are you sure that happened? You can say, hey, tell me more about your experience and how can I help you and how can I support you through this? So I guess I'm kind of framing what it should look like versus what it often looks like, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Someone else, anyone want to jump in? Yeah, Arlene.
I just wanted to say that I never meant to say that we shouldn't be calling people.
Yeah, I never thought you said that. Don't worry.
Acknowledge the danger,
Yes.
And I think that depending on where you are, you have to be strategic, and sometimes maybe try to engage the other women, before you speak out, and, just use strategies because, everybody recognizes, the women will recognize their vulnerability. But I also want to say that white women have been actively involved in racist groups. It's not like white women are better. Kathleen Blee has done amazing research on white women in white supremacist groups. And sometimes in order to prove to the men that they're just as good, they would advocate violence more than the men, And there's a question here. Can I respond to this?
Well, let me ask that question because that's the question I'm going to next. Thank you. So here's a final question from the audience. I'm an African-American woman who has a history of justified reasons to never trust white women or white men. What methods are you using to try to dissolve the barriers of distrust and fear that people of color have toward white people? And I think that's a very important question to end the Q&A, particularly as we talk about holding people accountable, because the reality is, particularly with Black folks, right, people of color who are always in the margins, we live in fear because we live in danger. We experience the danger. It is our reality. And we don't often have the white privilege that white women have to choose when to hold people accountable and when not. We often have to speak up even when it's dangerous, even if it means that it's going to cost us something, because it's literally life and death for us and our community. But white people, white women, they have white privilege to choose. And so because of that, there's often a distrust, right? There's a whole lot of reasons why there's distrust. So when you all talk about what methods are you using as co-conspirators to try to dissolve the barriers of distrust and fear that people of color have towards white people, and Arlene, we'll start with you.
Okay, I think that for white people, we have to understand that we're not trusted, and we have to understand that there's very good historical hundreds of years of reasons why we're not trusted. And we have to see that making change is good for us too. When you're in the throes of racism, you're kind of possessed. It's almost like being possessed by an outside force, And when you work on that, and I say, I'm a racist for life, I'm working on this for life, you free parts of yourself. But also you have to be out there. You have to be out there trying to change the world, And so when I, said I wanted to make women's studies a majority women of color, I got a lot of help from people of color on campus because they knew that I was trying to make this change for decades. And my experience was because they saw that that this was a value for me, people of color, particularly Black women, were enormously generous to me because they saw that I was out there doing the calling out, you know. So we have to work on ourselves, and then we have to act.
Thank you. Others?
Just to sort of underscore and build on that a little bit, I think one of the things that I'm committed to doing is reminding myself and helping to remind other white women in particular and white folks in general that trust is earned. It is, you are not owed it despite what you have been trained up in, despite how you've been indoctrinated. You are not inherently trustworthy, like Arlene said, and that it is earned through your actions, not through your claiming of ally, not through your titles, not through your whatever. And those actions are oftentimes going to go without cookies. They're going to go without recognition. And oftentimes those actions are happening in one-on-one conversations with your family, behind closed doors, and with yourself, right? And so like, if we aren't doing that work, anything else we're doing doesn't matter. And it's not pretty. And in some ways it's not fun, but it is also freeing. And I think that is a thing that we need to help people better understand, is like, there is a whole world of possibility, of relational connection, of care. There is like a whole nother thing that we can create, but we have to dispossess ourselves.
That's right.
Yeah, and I just want to go back just for a second to James Baldwin, because he is saying we can't become adults as white people until we understand where we are in our history. And white supremacy is our history, you know?
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Lindsey, that trust is earned, because particularly white women who are in leadership positions, they walk in with an assumption, this is white privilege at its best, that we ought to give you our trust. Trust is earned, just because you're in a powerful or a leadership position does not mean people going to trust you. People trust what you do behind closed doors. Because be clear, people who's been wronged often can smell it a mile away. And I think oftentimes there's this politic of respectability that's often in play, this nice, nasty that white women do well. You smile in my face and you call me friend when I know for sure you was talking about me behind my back, or you have a thought about me, that white gaze that's at play. We can smell it a mile away, right? And so trust is earned. And Arlene, I'm so glad you said it. And part of the trust is you modeling for Black people that you're a co-conspirator and not expecting to be rewarded.
Right.
You're doing the hard work to dismantle white supremacy in your space, not for Black people, for your own humanity. When you approach this work starting for you first, it looked differently, because there's a level of performance that happens in justice work where white people come and want to perform because they want to look like they're liberal and they're free, you know, they're this justice-minded person, right? And looking for rewards, and they really doing it for themselves. When you approach this work recognizing that white supremacy is eating at your soul, it affects your own humanity, right? You approach this work as co-conspirator first for you and your own humanity. It looks different because you're fighting for your own humanity. It looks different. Others, and how do you model, or what methods do you offer to help those who are marginalized to begin to trust you, to walk this walk together as human beings, to create this kind of community we hope for?
Yeah, thinking about this kind of from the electoral political perspective, having conversations like this is really important. Especially pushing these conversations to result in white women and men voting for candidates that are actually going to help Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, and just humanity as a whole. Like we were kind of naming some statistics earlier. If those statistics change, I think that's kind of some proof that, you know, we actually are changing the way, and we're wanting to change who's in leadership. We also have to strike this balance between educating ourselves, but also listening to, you know, our Black brothers and sisters. and not putting burden on them to tell us, you know, what we should be doing. We need to be figuring that out ourselves. We also do need to be listening to what needs to be taking place. And so from the electoral political perspective, we need to be, you know, we need to not think, okay, when we have a slate of candidates, we need to say, the answer does not need to be, okay, this is as good as we can do. It's no, we need to be figuring out how we elevate people to run for lower levels of office or get involved in a lower level appointed position, or really building a bench of good people to just be part of our civic process. And if we as white people can contribute to that, I think that's a really important job for us, to use our power as white people to be co-conspirators. We need to be changing who is in leadership, but we also, through voting, but also through just our other power structures that we do have leverage in.
Awesome. I want to say thank you all so much for being part of this very delicate conversation as co-conspirators. And as we close the space, let me invite you all to share your final words with our viewers this afternoon. Election season is coming to an end in 8, maybe 9 days. I think my number is off. And so what would you say? This conversation is for white women. This conversation here is, and we were intentional about that for white women. So I want to invite you to address our white women audience as they go to the polls. What would you offer words for them as they go to the polls? We'll start with you, Miss Arlene.
I think what everyone here has said is to think of the larger picture. What kind of world do we want? What kind of society do we want? Do we want a society that's pitting people against each other, as it has for hundreds of years? Or do we want a society where everybody can flower and contribute to the larger good? You know? And I think it's possible to make those choices.
Thank you, Miss Arlene. Reverend Stephanie, words, your closing words as we leave this space. What would you offer white women who are watching going to the polls this week?
I think that it's just making sure that our words match our actions and our values. If you see an all white space, ask yourself, what is the modus operandi for that space? What is happening and what can happen? You know, decenter your own understanding of your privilege and how you situate yourself in relationship to other people, so that you listen faithfully, listen authentically, and listen with vision cast by other people, particularly Black women. Listen to if you have on your Instagram nothing but Black Lives Matter, as you should be saying this out loud, and yet the images of you in your community are all white, you have to start to deconstruct the way in which we understand our relationship to each other and the relationship to the vision that we are casting together this election season by centering, supporting, and lifting up women and people of color, and making sure that you go out and vote, and you vote with a mindset that is one of wholeness for justice and equity for all people.
Reverend Stephanie, thank you so much for being here. Jolie Grace, would you offer your closing words, particularly to women, white women who are going to the polls to vote this week?
Yeah, I would say number one is to go vote. So many of us white women sit it out, and we don't recognize the importance and the power that we have with our vote. But also, further than that, when you know who you're going to vote for, ask yourself why. Ask yourself how you came to that conclusion, and ask yourself if you think that you included other people's ideas into your decision about who to vote for. Think about who those people really are. You know, we need to be aware that our political structure and our system is so polarizing right now that even if you think that you're getting a diversity of thought, you're probably not. And then also social media, like it separates us so much. So even though you might be thinking that you're hearing from a lot of individuals, you're hearing from a lot of like-minded individuals who probably look like you. And so figure out ways once you know who you're voting for, or before you know who you're voting for, really try to get out of your bubble, which is harder to do than we think in this very polarized and virtual world. But do what you can to get out of yourself, get out of your bubbles, and really try to think about what's important to other people, and then go vote.
Awesome. Jolie, Grace, thank you so much for being present in this conversation this afternoon. Reverend Dr. Lillian, share with particularly the white women, I'm thinking the suburb mom, right, who's going to vote this week. Talk to them about the impact of their vote.
Yeah, it's hard to come towards the end because I certainly want to echo so many of the good things that have been said. I think 2020 is a year made for discomfort. I think the global pandemic has pushed us all out of normal routines, and a vital racial justice awakening has taken place at the exact same moment. And so I think it is a year that invites discomfort for white women. And so my charge to women whose embodiment looks like mine is to lean into that, because there is so much good stuff to be interrogated and learned, and so many ways for us to come away from this year in particular with better understandings, and to take those understandings to then seek to be better connected to our siblings.
Awesome. Reverend Dr. Lillian, thank you so much for being with us and being present and being a co-conspirator in this conversation. Last but certainly not least, our moderator and friend, co-conspirator in this work, Lindsey Godwin. I want to invite you to offer final words as we leave this space. Talk to white women who are going to vote this week about their impact of their vote.
Yeah. Here's what I believe. I believe that we can build another world, another possibility. And I think we've laid that out 1,000 times over in this conversation. And to do that, it takes a lot of different ways of being and ways of acting. So voting is one of those vital tools that we need to build this world. And then after you vote, think about the other ways in which you can join in the work of building a new world. What is that world you want? What is the world we want? Because this one that perpetuates violence against us, right? White supremacy and patriarchy are trying to kill everyone, white women included. And particularly it targets our Black and brown siblings, our queer and trans siblings, our immigrant siblings. But it is not a system of thriving and possibility making and joy, right? So what does it mean to create and craft a world of community making and thriving and joy? How do we do that? Carry that with you into the voting booth, and then figure out the next step. What is the next tool you're going to do? Like, what are you going to do on your school board, or with the moms you drop your kids off at daycare, or with your church group or your book club? And you don't have to do perfect. You can't. I screw up all of the time. We all screw up all the time. Take a risk. Build a harder connection, a better connection, a deeper connection. Do the hard work a little bit at a time. And I promise you will feel more free.
Wow, the Lindsey Godwin, thank you so much for being in this place and to moderate this conversation. And let me give you, our viewers, a challenge. I challenge you to share this video on your posts, because I bet someone in your community needs to hear from other women, other white women, calling white women out to call them back in the polls. God bless you and keep you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.